So this topic came up while I was working on my second channel, Fictional Mindbender, on how basically it said how the High Elves of Middle Earth and the Vulcans of Star Trek were virtually the same thing when it came to how they handled their emotions. And I wanted to take a deeper look at that because I love both franchises and it's a interesting and, no pun intended, fascinating concept. Now, in Tolkien's books, the Eldar generally have two different faces. The one they showed other races of being stoic and beautiful and serene, and just basically the ideal of perfection, so to speak. And the other being a deeply haunted sense of sorrow, deep grudges, intense rage, and just feeling things very intensely, even simple things at times such as childlike joy. The more Quindi, the Dark Elves, are more presented as the latter than the former, since they were not raised nor wanted to go to Valinor in the first place. And for that, and because of how this affected how they handled their feelings, some of the Noldor judged them to be basically more savage and less civilized, an image that only got worse the further east in Middle-earth one went. Now, the movies tend to portray this dynamic to a degree, but focus more heavily on the alien and spiritual stoicism aspect, while the Hobbit movies actually showed more of the laid-back and casual nature that was not really concerned with how other races saw them. So basically, you have two very different portrayals of elves in the two Peter Jackson trilogies. Now, I've said before how the difference between the elves and the other races wasn't just in their natural immortality, but also their deep perception of time and space and the very nature of Arda. Best exemplified in the Noldor, and how that the longer they remained in Middle-earth, the weaker they became compared to when they first arrived and just basically ran roughshod over the armies of orcs with a divine rage that even the Sindar were lacking. The Noldor feel their emotions deeply, especially extroverted ones like ambition, anger, aggression, loyalty, and so on. The Teleri of the Valinor feel a deep spiritual connection to their ships and the sea, and also hold deep grudges that are not easily turned aside, even at behest of the Valar themselves, and are so hypersensitive to creation that when they brought the army of the West to Middle-earth for the War of Wrath, the devastation of the land and its scarring was so severe that they flat out refused to step one foot on it. Thanks, we appreciate that. And then you have my favorite ones, the Vanyar, who have that deep spiritual contentment and joy of just being in the presence of the divine. Essentially, "In the Valar we trust" is literally their motto. Now, meanwhile, the Vulcans of the Star Trek universe also have two faces, much like the Eldar. To outsiders, it's one of logic, a knowing calmness, and a devotion to logic that is so extreme, as other races see it at least, that many find them to be irritating, and that they hold this face even in the face of extreme circumstances such as death and pain. However, their second face is more private, is the raw, quote-unquote, tempest of emotions that is so extreme that the few who have witnessed a Vulcan losing their shit often find themselves deeply disturbed afterwards. That, in fact, this second face is actually their natural state if you go deeper into their extremely violent history. For all intents and purposes, Vulcans are the most dangerous race in the Star Trek universe because of how deep they suppress those violent emotions and how intensely they run, to the point that it's barely controlled, if ever, were it not for logic. When I look at these two factoids of the two franchises, higher beings, I certainly saw the commenter's point on the matter. Both species seem to run a tight line on controlling themselves, Both feel emotions so profoundly that other races misjudge them as being shallower than they actually are. And when let off the leash, both can be visibly terrifying to witness. And both try to follow some kind of higher calling or order in order to legitimize their positions. That said, the differences are still there, and they're very subtle, primarily being that the Eldar seek to control themselves via spiritual means, because they are at the core spiritual beings, that their flesh is just a shell, while Vulcans are much more pragmatic and scientific. They had their gods at one point, and one can see traces of their spirituality in the rituals that they still use in order to get a deeper sense of logic, if they have the honor of seeing that, that is, because it is a very private and personal matter for them. But they primarily rely on extreme mental discipline and devotion to logic to control themselves and rise above those feelings. And of course, this goes without saying that the creators of both universes had vastly different perspectives on this, so I'm putting that aside for right now. That being said, the Eldar also embrace emotions as an expression, and it's only wrong in how and when it's tapped into, whereas the Vulcans try to swear off it completely because they're just too dangerous to risk, quite frankly. Yet, if one is sharp enough, they may pick up on a Vulcan telling a low-key joke from time to time, or get a disturbing sense of deep rage even if the Vulcan is not saying anything. The effect that this has on others, though, is pretty much the same. A perception of alienness and distance, even if you're standing side by side with them. There's almost always a sense of not understanding the other, except by a certain few who manage to bridge that gap, or at least come very close to it. Now, the other two similarities between the Eldar and the Vulcans is that they have a similar purpose story-wise, in that both of them are there to help the other races of their universe. Supposed to be, anyway. Though, for the elves, this is on borrowed time, while the Vulcans, it's as long as the show runs, basically. And the last being that they are both have offshoots of the culture that reject the high road that they're taking. The Dark Elves, as I mentioned before, and the Romulans. Both branches being regarded as sus and particularly dangerous if one isn't careful. The Sylvan Elves, for example, have a deep hate for orcs and goblins that even outdoes their Eldar cousins. So, yeah, making comparisons between the Vulcans and the Eldar is definitely fair. Perhaps the creators feel the need to have one race act as a foil for the protagonists to continue to push the story along further. But if you have any comments or observations about this below, please let me know. This is the Miller Philosopher, and y'all have a good day.